I had meant to do a little bit of a demo as well, but I brought my framework laptop and I forgot that I didn't install the recommended distribution, so it didn't have any. It didn't have the drivers, I guess. But yeah, it's fine. Everything I'll be talking about today is going to be pretty straightforward if you were to set it up yourself. You know, kind of spirit of open source forensics. Oh, thank you. It's mainly using this framework called Dissect. If any of you have heard of it, it's written by the folks at Foxit NCDC Group. Just basically working with disk forensic artifacts there, and then of course using volatility. Let me see what button I'm supposed to press to advance. Okay, cool. So yeah, I'm not going to give a slide for myself here because this talk is not really affiliated with any company. But the motivation is basically kind of continuing to expand the set of forensic artifacts we have when we're doing incident response. When I was doing incident response work, you know, some of the research and development we would have to do is every new remote control and management tool, RMM tool that shows up in an incident, we want to find additional forensic artifacts for that so we can see if it was used for things like initial access, persistence, lateral movement, you know, even using remote desktop features to escalate privileges, and ultimately data exfiltration is what usually happens. But you know, in forensics, we see a lot of these different RMM tools being used in different ways. It's important to understand if you're a customer, if you have any of these in your environment. Hopefully, you only use one, and that makes it a lot easier for incident response teams to classify activity. So this builds on some prior work that's been done. A lot of the work on these artifacts were done by folks at Trend Micro incident response team, and you know, these screenshots come from a document that they've shared, and it's been very helpful in just kind of conceptualizing the different places that artifacts might be in for these different tools. You know, we've got, you know, application specific logs and databases and files. You might have entries in the registry and event logs, but of course this is just on the disk forensic side of things. But yeah, this research is kind of just expanding to look at Zoom and see what we can get, see what they're dropping on the disk. But yeah, also as far as the threat vector and attacks that have been seen using Zoom, there's this group called Elusive Comment. This isn't my research, so I'm just giving the high level tactics. Basically, they will send you a Zoom invite, and you'll allow remote control connections. They'll request that, and then I think they typically are using PowerShell to paste a command to initiate a downloader. Some of the IOCs I looked into, some of them look like async rat. I'm not really sure. I didn't do the whole malware deep dive on these, but I'm sure that's interesting as well. But ultimately, it seems like their goal is to target people with cryptocurrency wallets. So a lot of social engineering, it seems to be the motivation so far. So just at a high level, the experiment, or you know, kind of trying to harvest forensic artifacts from Zoom. I didn't do any reverse engineering for the purposes of this. I think, you know, that's obviously a gray area if you're looking at a commercial tool, but it would be a lot easier to tell what's going on if I did reverse engineer it, but I didn't. And you know, just trying to see what windows, for example, since this experiment was done mainly on Windows, I wanted to see if there were any artifacts of remote desktop connections, like known protocols. Would we get something like a remote login of a type we recognize, or like a special login? I was really interested in that. So yeah, for this experiment, basically set up virtual machines of Windows 10 and Windows 11, just to demonstrate what artifacts come through when an attack is performed. And using virtual machines was able to get the virtual machine image and memory image. So this is just a bit of the setup and procedure. probably a bit too verbose to talk through all the steps. But I also installed Sysmon just because I don't work at an EDR company anymore. But it is usually helpful to have certain artifacts related to the network connections, just because that stuff isn't normally logged. Also enabled process creation, auditing. I was hoping to get some logs from Windows Defender that I've seen in cases, but I think the logs that I was looking for are in the DLP, upgrade. So the Defender logs that I wanted weren't available, but there are some related to remote desktop and copy to clipboard, which is helpful if you're trying to detect if there is exfiltration over the clipboard. And then I didn't do the self-signed certain PCAP capture to do the full analysis of the network traffic, but I think that's something that would be a good step. Snapshots and kind of demonstrating the attack by sending, basically I install Zoom Enterprise on the guest and the host, start a meeting from the host, join it in the guest, allow remote control and sharing clipboard, and then I take over in the host, do a couple of things, file opening, file writing, copying the clipboard, and then I disconnect. So those were the steps that I took. Just going over a couple of the things that I mentioned, I was hoping, for certain anchor points. If there's a remote login, we've got like a session ID, and we can kind of pivot using that. If we've got child processes from Zoom, ideally, those are all captured in the 4688s that we're auditing. And then if there are any Zoom specific logs, maybe some of them are plain text, and we can take a look at whether there's anything being logged for file access or copying the clipboard. And then, of course, these are the Windows Defender logs that I was mentioning that didn't end up being relevant here, but maybe I just don't know how to enable them for auditing. As I mentioned, I don't know if these commands are visible, but was using dissect for the disk forensic analysis part of things, and these are a couple of commands that might be helpful. So the first command is just to dump a whole bunch of artifacts using their plugins. There could be, looking at this, I didn't put prefetch in there. There's things that I didn't include in here, but they have a long list of artifacts. You can basically dump everything if you like. I would say that the reason why I also have copy event logs from targets here is because dissect, they do parse event logs. They're written in Python, so it's not really the fastest. And if you're doing this in a pipeline, I would actually probably recommend you copy out the event logs and then use something a little bit more heavyweight like Chainsaw and Hayabusa to do your event log analysis. But this is something you can do, and when I'm just testing with a very short period of time, it's not very many event logs anyway. So then I have a command here for keyword searching, just a really easy way you can use their tool rdump to select any event that matches a keyword, basically. Just a really easy way to start out when you don't know what you're looking for. And then super timelining. Basically, when you use rdump, it outputs the events in like a record type. It's basically a dictionary. But you can output it in JSON-L format, and then you can use their tool to bring all those JSON-L files that are kind of segmented by artifact. You can bring them all together, and you order them by the timestamp. They can basically do multiple timestamps per event, if it's a file creation versus file modification. So that's how you do your super timelining. It's actually very fun to get to this point in 3 commands. It's wonderful. But yeah, after super timelining, you'll end up with a super timeline, and moving on to so basically expectations versus reality here. I was hoping that there might be some kind of remote desktop like RDP type login that was prompted when you do the remote control sharing, but it didn't work like that. There were no, I took note of my public IP address, and it seems like we only got connections in the event logs for Sysmon and Didn't have any 4624s related to remote logins. We just had interactive logins, which are probably from the virtual machine host. And no, the only remote IPs were from Zoom's domain. So nothing like a direct connection or threat actor IPs that you could be looking for in your event logs. No session identifiers associated with the remote login, and of course we did have the child processes of Zoom, and you can take that information and then pivot to the memory side of things, which we're going to do to see if the Zoom processes did any access to objects in memory, which they should. And then I went looking into the Zoom application specific logs, which I'll talk about in a little bit. A lot of them were encrypted, and others were SQLite databases that I dug into a little bit, but not completely. So there could be some juice there. But here's also another artifact. This is just output of dissect. Again, this is specifically, this artifact is, I wish they labeled the artifacts, but this one is the application. This is the application timeline artifact from the system resource usage monitor. So there was a little bit of interesting data here. Okay. So this shows the bytes sent and bytes received from the Zoom application. I think this event took place like during the copy to clipboard event. So that could be interesting, seeing like bytes transferred out of Zoom, but it's not really very definitive. If you've looked at this system resource usage monitor before, it's hard to tell if the bytes match exactly to some file that's been sent, or you're just looking at some other type of communication. I did also have entries in the application timeline table of the system resource usage monitor. But outside of the event logs and outside of this, and then we had master file table type access and USN journal. That was most of the disk-based forensic artifacts, and then of course there's application-specific stuff from Zoom. So moved on to memory forensics. This is kind of what I had to expect from a memory perspective, like what objects would be accessed by Zoom. I wasn't really sure what I was going to encounter there. Was hopefully looking for handles to desktops or handles to any of the files that I opened or copied. And upon running a lot of the volatility stuff on the last snapshot I took, various ways of scanning for processes, so using PS scan here because things weren't really showing up in the PS list yet. What I did was, after taking the snapshot, I waited for about 5 minutes, and then I shut the machine down, hoping to make sure everything was flushed to disk for the disk artifacts, but the snapshot is what I was looking at for the memory. Not sure exactly if I should maybe wait a little bit longer before taking the snapshot. But basically, we did get a couple Zoom-related processes, and then when we look at the network connections with NetScan, those IPs are associated with the Zoom domain. So nothing really standing out from a network perspective. Nothing from the desktop perspective as well. It didn't seem like Zoom was creating or handling any type of desktop object. So we end up with like a lot more questions than answers when it comes to both the memory and the application specific logs and databases side of things. So these were a couple of the directories and files that I saw being modified by during the simulated attack. There may be others that are significant. Obviously, a lot of these have encrypted in their file name, so analyzing them wasn't super fruitful yet. I definitely think, application owners kind of making it more difficult to do forensics is the name of the game here, I guess. But yeah, I didn't try to reverse engineer Zoom to get these keys out. But some of the SQLite databases are unencrypted and might have a little bit of juice to squeeze there. But definitely not as easy as something like AnyDesk or a Terra agent, where the logs are plain text right there. So yeah, leads to my conclusion. Definitely, there is, I think, a lot going on in Zoom. I'm definitely curious now how they're even handling the remote connection, and why Windows doesn't seem to be aware of it. Sysmon doesn't seem to say much about it either. So yeah, I do have like a lot of questions that normally would lead me to working with Binary Ninja, but yeah, there's a lot of questions left and a lot of interesting work that could be done. But it does seem like Zoom could be a bit of a blind spot if we're talking about RMM tools. And yeah, some references. Links to the GitHub for Dissect and the great research done by the Trend Micro team. But that's all I've got. So if anybody's got any questions, happy to answer about the process or the findings.